All right, everyone. Welcome to the How to Become a Composer panel, as presented by OCReMix. Thank you for coming. Yay! Okay, you said that.
Because I'm the only not pro up here, so that's probably a good idea if I talk a little bit. Otherwise, I should just go sit down. Okay. All right. So, like Amy said, how to become a pro VGM composer. We have two panelists up here with us. I'm your moderator, Sharik. So, why don't we introduce ourselves? Okay.
Hey guys, I'm Will Roger. I am a composer. I usually do orchestral soundtracks, so I worked on Star Wars: The Old Republic, Star Wars: First Assault, Lara Croft and the Temple of Osiris, and currently I'm writing Canada 2.
I'm Andrew Versa, also known as Zircon on OCReMix. I work games like Soul Calibur 5, Monkey Island 2 Special Edition with Will as an arranger. I've done some live concert arrangements for Video Games Live, this is on OCR. Recently, I did the soundtrack for Dungeon Mats on Steam, which is a cool game. And yeah, and also a sound designer. So.
By the way, I'm also a Buster team.
Alright, so I guess we can get started. The way this panel is going to work is we have a couple of talking points that we're going to talk about, but if at any point during the panel you have a question, throw your hand up. We will answer, try to do our best to, or these guys rather, will try to do the best. I'm not going to answer any questions. So first of all, and I got this from Andy, what is pro?
The first two things I wrote is what is pro? And what is
composer? What does that mean? So what's pro?
Just
what does that mean?
The reason I wrote this was because I think there are people that work as video game composers, so it's a little unusual actually to see somebody that does absolutely nothing except write music for video games. So they don't produce, they don't arrange, they don't do any mixing, they don't do any sound. Like it's very much the kind of thing where it's multidisciplinary. And when it comes to there's film and TV and music libraries and commercials, and often you see among our colleagues, and definitely both of us, you find yourself doing a lot of different stuff. So I don't think I want to make it clear there's really not exactly a black and white line between, okay, this person is not pro and then all of a sudden they're pro. I mean, one definition is you get paid for it, but I got paid $10 to do my first soundtrack, so I don't know if I would call myself pro. But, so I just want to say that up front first.
Well, Andy, is that good?
Yeah, that's good. I mean, there's always going to be projects that you'll work on, maybe when you're in high school or college, and that's one thing. Then once you graduate, you're all completely on your own. Then it's like that's when you start to move to the distinction of like, well, this is how I'm making money. So that's where it's kind of drawn the line.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, very cool. So, as composers, what kind of formal training do you have? Do you need formal training to become pro, or you shake his head?
I would say no. I mean, yeah, okay. I do have a degree in music, but as soon as I set foot on campus, I already knew more about music production than literally every other person on campus. So it was like there's not really about that. It's more about theoretical and historical content about it. Being able to solve bigger problems, I guess, and understand bigger context of what you're doing. That's what's getting a music degree helpful, because you'll study classical, but also 20th century modern music. And you'll learn a lot more in music perspective. I think that as far as, there are technical schools, so that's another thing. If you're talking about a conservatory, then it's going to be more about that sort of theoretical background, which I think helps you in the long run, but it's not completely necessary. You can learn on this.
Where did you guys attend? Did you get your yourselves? Where did you go?
I have an undergrad at Yale.
I went to Drexel University for music industry. And I'll mention so with regards to my degree, so I took some traditional music. That was definitely part of the degree, and I agree with Will 100% that it's not the kind of thing where you go to school and they teach you like everything A to Z, 0 to 100%. To a large extent, it's up to you to sort of synthesize everything, everything that you're learning. So you might take a class in, jazz history. There might be things that you learn in that class that you can apply to the soundtracks that you're working on. Maybe you study an artist or a composer, and you find something interesting about what they did, the sort of experimental techniques they used to apply that. So basically, I think the short answer, we're both in agreement. You don't need formal training, but it can be very helpful. It doesn't. I also don't think it has to be a college degree necessarily. It could be if you're working with a teacher, a private teacher. There are a lot of very talented composition teachers, for example.
Yeah, I would say that the best training you can possibly do is outside the classroom. It's transcription. It's dictation. If you have a piece of music that you really like and you want to find out, well, how do they do that? How do they do all this? Listen to it and transcribe it. Put it down into notes and figure out exactly what they did. It's like active listening. It takes a lot of practice to do that. But that's honestly how I learn every single style that I've written. It's just one of these transcripts. VGMusic.com.
There you go.
Looks the same.
Yeah, they have not updated that site before. So I want to go back to something that Andy talked about a little bit. He talked about multidiscipline. Outside of music, what kind of things are useful for getting into the industry? I know Andy, you used to program some old RPG, text-based RPGs and stuff when you were younger.
On
IRC. But do you find that having knowledge about those disciplines kind of helps you navigate the game industry a little bit more?
Yeah,
better.
And I know Bill knows a lot more than I do about the internal game development because he worked in-house at LucasArts for years. But basically, there are a lot of skills that can come in handy. Some that you wouldn't even expect would be relevant at all whatsoever. For example, if you study graphic design, or if you've done some graphic design and you're familiar with color palettes and maybe 3D modeling, shaders, maybe you just did it for fun or a mod or something like that. You never know when that's going to come in handy if you were doing music for a game and you're trying to talk to artists and you're trying to coordinate sound effects for an animation or even just making things for your own website or portfolio. So I find myself at home. I do a lot of video editing, which I didn't really expect I would have to do as a composer, but I put up tutorial videos on my website, and I kind of do video editing, which has been very helpful. So having a well-rounded skill set is, I'd say, very rare.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, it's your industry. So I would say, any way you can immerse yourself in, how everything is created, that just gives you more people that you can talk to. You can talk to a tech artist, you can talk to an engineer, a graphics guy, and you can say, hey, this is actually really interesting what you do. And then, through that, you build relationships, and then, maybe that means that because now you're friends with this tech artist, now you'll be like, oh, I know this composer, it's really cool, maybe you should do something. And so that's how every single game happens. It's by someone all these people and they got better.
Yeah.
So networking is very important.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and also just the more disciplines I don't think it's very rare to see somebody let's say graduate from a conservatory program. I'm a composer. Sign me up for the next game soundtrack, please. It never unfortunately works like that. Okay, all right. Okay, maybe a few exceptions, but generally speaking, it's because you're involved.
Right. Okay. Very nice. So, sort of going off of that, networking is very, very important. Probably for any job. Really, it's a lot about that. Who you know. So, what are some opportunities for networking that are really beneficial? Right. How do you network? How do you get started? Especially when it comes to the game industry, because I know a lot of times people ask the question, how do I get in? It's just like this big thing. How do I get my foot in the door? What do I do? Who do I have to talk to? Who do I have to kill, to get this job?
It's almost, that one question is
It's a massive question, yeah.
And, you know, Will just said pretty much that a lot of gigs, I'd say the vast majority are not, when talking about music specifically, it's not somebody posting something online and saying, composer wanted. It happens with indie games, I think, a little bit more often. Just like okay, right. It's very rare. It's very rare. It does happen, I guess, sometimes. But when it comes to getting in, I think an approach that might be more helpful to look at for yourself is instead of trying to think about like, okay, I'm a composer, I want to give my business card and my demo to as many people as possible. Even if that's what you actually want to do, it's more beneficial to just become friendly with people, make friends, and it's very hard to know in advance. Sure, if you want to become friends with an audio lead at a AAA developer, it's probably maybe more valuable than somebody that has nothing to do with games or music whatsoever. But you really never know. You could meet somebody or go to school with somebody that seems to be in an unrelated industry. You're friendly with them, you keep in touch, and you're connected through Facebook, and every so often you post like, hey, I'm working on such and such soundtrack. And they might contact you next time. They might, if they run into a situation where they or somebody they know need music, and they say, oh, who's that guy that I went to school with? Oh, he did music, sure. It really can happen like that, more than you would think. So just becoming friends with people and sort of keeping yourself on the radar in a non-obnoxious way, without literally any business cards, can actually really work.
Yeah, I think that you'll find that there's no two stories that are remotely similar as far as like, oh, how did you get your first gig into the industry? There's no commonality to it. If there were, then great for really But no, it's more about being everywhere you possibly can and being friendly with people and getting along with people that you like. I think is the most important. It doesn't matter like don't go up to like some like hotshot composer who's like super famous and then be like, hey, I should be friends with you because you're. It doesn't matter. It's more about befriending people who are at any level because you never know what you would need. You never know like, oh, I can't finish this score on time because I have to compromise whatever. Good thing I know composers who are kind of just starting out, but I think that they're very talented and I'll work with them. That's very important to have that sort of support. I will say that on the Tomb Raider soundtrack, every last musician that I hired for that entire score was a MAGfest attendee. Every single one. And in fact, most of them we actually met because we were at like one of the hotel rooms and we all just busted out of it, so we just kind of started playing. And I was like, oh wow, you're really good. I should probably hire you for something. And a couple months later, the phone rang and it was Tomb Raiders on it. So suddenly I had this very rich network of musicians. Now, to expand on this is probably the next part, but I'll just kind of move ahead. Is more practical applications of networking. The two things I want to talk about are forums and conferences. So as far as forums, I would say there's lots of forums that are specific to video game, video audio. The ones that I would recommend that are on Facebook as well as their own forum are Game Audio and Denizens. It's a private Facebook group, but if you join it, you have to be added by someone. But if you really are very serious about that, then maybe come talk to me, and then I'll take your name down, and then I can make sure that.
And you have to promise to not be needlessly self-promotional.
Yeah, don't just be like, hey, I just joined, here's my demo, like they'll kick you out immediately. They'll be like, oh, boo. The other one is the Game Audio Network Guild. It's a paid membership, but there's lots of benefits, like you get lots of discounts. They have a lot of content there, like sample contracts and that kind of thing. They're really trying to build community, and I think they're still pretty much the largest, most powerful organization for video game audio. So it's definitely something that you want to keep in mind. I think Spencer, there's a Game Audio Network hang tonight, right? It's like, could you like stand up and say where it is?
Yeah, it's actually the Cadillac branch at 7 p.m. If you go right out of the lobby doors, you can literally see the Cadillac branch right across the street.
Yeah, and Audio Game is a wonderful organization. Started by Tony Kondo, who unfortunately couldn't join us. But almost all the neighborhood leads in some way or another came from the fact that I was in game audio. So it's a very important thing to keep on the radar.
Wait, we would be remiss to not mention overclocked remix as well. Okay, very good. Just making sure.
This panel is presented by Overclock Remix. So.
Yeah, but you did actually, honestly, you took the first step. And of all the musicians that I did not meet through MAGfest, I met through Overclock. So again, it's a very good resource. You can find people whose music you enjoy. You think, hey, you're very talented, I'd like to work with you. And then you'll build a relationship. And then the other two are more, once you already have a firm grasp of like how to write your music and you're ready to take on work, I would recommend going to Kickstarter. There's lots of games that are being made in a very early stage, so you can go to Kickstarter to find like, hey, so do you guys need like a sound designer, do you need music, that kind of thing. And lastly, TIG-Source, which I think stands for indie games.
Yeah.
TIG-Source is where a lot of indie game developers will post, work in progress stuff about their game. So if you see something that you really like, really special, then go ahead and tell them, hey, the game is pretty cool. I'd like to work with you. Do you have any availability?
Yeah.
Very cool.
Does that like make sense? It's such a hard question to answer. Does that if that was running through anybody's head, like how do I get it? Does that give you some ideas? But is there anything like kind of unclear from that? If so, raise your hand.
Yeah.
Expand on it.
Again, Mike, we have a question over here. Yeah.
What's the name of the Facebook group?
The Facebook group is Game Audio Denizens.
Denizens, okay.
Yeah.
And the next part of this was conferences. Again, I can't talk about MAGfest enough because this is where you really become friends with people, which is super important. Acquaintances are like cool, like actual friends are you hire you. But the other ones you might want to consider are, I mean, hierarchy, do you guys have a
PAX?
PAX, yeah.
PAX is interesting. I mean, I'm not just monitoring this panel, but it's a fun conference. I mean, it's a trade. I mean, it's just for games, it's just hanging out, playing lots of games and stuff.
I know guys like Jimmy Big Giant Circles, like Danny Baranowski, they go to PAX, and so that might be a little bit better if you have already maybe done some indie games. You've met a few people maybe online, and you want to hang out with them and solidify that further.
Yeah.
I will say that PAX they do a big indie mega booth, which is like a giant section of the show floor dedicated to just indie games. So it's a good way of meeting people. I mean, as just for OCReMix, I've gone up to people to talk about OCReMix and say, hey, if you're interested in releasing a soundtrack on OCReMix, we have a label, we do that. It's a good way to meet lots of indie developers because they're all kind of put together in a big block.
Which is another big point. I think it's equally important to meet up with other musicians as well as the developers themselves. Because at the end of the day, most of your work will come from, especially for indie games, it will come from like the programmer who's making this game or the artist who runs it, or even to like whoever's the project doing this.
Yeah.
Not necessarily from other musicians. And then the last conference that I wanted to mention was GDC, the Game Developers Conference. My thought on it, and feel free to disagree, but I think that even though they have a student program, which might be interesting to check out, I think that GDC is a little bit too expensive to go to unless you already have a little bit of a footing. So I would recommend going to these forums first and making a lot of contacts there and getting a little bit ahead of the game so that you can go to GDC prepared. Because it's like $1,000 and you don't want to just show up and not have anyone to talk to. So you want to try to set up meetings ahead of time and try to befriend people a little bit before you sort of jump into the meeting.
I actually agree with 100%. There's a question here, I think.
Yes. I'm instrumental in like I'm already the same group that if I'm interested in contributing instrumental tracks to somebody else's project or another composer's project.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's great to hear. Like, I would always recommend, I think that for an instrumentalist, going to places like MAGfest and the OCR forum especially, is a great place to meet other musicians. If you're interested in game remixing, like, do you do like production as well?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, by all means integrate your playing into your remixes. Because that's a great way to not only make the sound better, but then other people might want to collaborate with you, and you might get to work with people who are doing a video game, like scoring a video game. I mean, again, like all of the musicians that I've ever worked with, I either met on OCR or here at MAGfest. With, I guess, one exception, also the sample libraries. Yeah, I mean, you're always hiring your friends, so the trick to getting hired is to make more money.
Another thing is that even if you're just doing like free stuff to start with, we can talk more about working for free later. That's something, but Joe is a perfect example of your expert novice on the OCR forums. He plays like a million instruments, and I mean, he came to OCR and contributed several remixes, and he worked on a project that I directed. And that was all free stuff, but he has I've since asked him to record for countless tracks. So far, I've been paying him in sample libraries because that's what I have. But now he has almost all of them, so you have to start paying him real money. But the point is that I met him on OCR, and it was just like for fun projects first, and then I saw, wow, this guy's great, and he has a good recording setup, and he plays a lot of stuff. By the way, I would make sure that you have a decent recording setup, for sure.
Yeah, that's very important. Yeah, a very high quality microphones.
Very cool. So you kind of started talking about it a little bit, but a lot of times you see, especially in the OCR forums, a couple times you see like some indie game programmers posting on forums asking, they're looking for someone to do a soundtrack for their game, but they don't have any money. So they're like, oh, it's a really good opportunity for this, and So what are your thoughts about working, for exposure? I mean, I know that for exposure are like two most, they're loaded words, and especially for artists of any discipline. So what are your thoughts on that? And we can kind of, I guess, segue into legally, like contracts and that kind of stuff. We'll talk a little bit about that.
Well, I'm curious, so how many people here have done it? Well, how many people here have written music for a game project before or played? Okay, we have these number of people.
Yeah.
So, of this group, how many of you have worked on a game project? So not like a remix thing, but a project that was distributed in some way free. Maybe we worked for free. Okay. So I think there's I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with working for free. In terms of, if we're defining free as you're not getting paid dollars up front, or Vietnamese dollars. The key thing is you have to just change the way you're looking at it. If you're working for free, you have to think of it as an investment. And if you're investing in something, if you were to invest in a stock or a mutual fund or whatever, you would think about, well, where's this company, where's this stock headed? So, for example, I did music and the sound design for a game called Dungeon Bands, which came out, and thankfully it is done really well. It's on Steam, it's got great reviews, it's got posted on Kotaku, etc. I'll say now that I did take that game for free, but it was free with royalties. So if the game never came out, I would never have paid. But I invested my time into that because after meeting the developer and seeing his credits and playing the game, I was very, very confident that the growth was going to be there and that it was going to be a success. He had worked for AAA companies before. He had something great that was playable and fun. So that's a situation where, and my work for free. I've been asked to work for free on projects where people don't spell my name right, or they want to make a game that is like based on Batman and nothing to do with DC whatsoever. They're like, yeah, we just need to get the rights. Yeah. Just these projects that are clearly not above board. And so you wouldn't want to invest into a company like that, even if it's not a company, but it's that mindset. So that's what I think about it.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, I think it's exceptionally rare to find a project where they want to get a composer for free, but the project is actually promising enough to be worth your time. It's just very, I'm not going to say it's unusual, but it's just very hard to find something like that. I mean, not that you'd be looking to work for free, but you see what I mean. It's just like finding a project that is promising enough to be worth your time, even if you're not getting paid. So, I mean, for me personally, I've kind of used that almost as a barometer. Like, there's certain points in budget where it's like, I just can't go beneath that because it's like, you know, the risk associated with it as far as like, will this game ever get finished? Will this game ever amount to anything and be like worth it? It just becomes kind of astronomical. The odds just heavily stack against you. But that said, I think that if you're just starting out, I mean, there's some composers who can just sort of write. They don't need a project to kind of force their ideas to become like a unified source. And so, yeah, if you're that guy, then you don't really need to work on the project just yet. You have to make an album. You can, work on those remixes to like build up your production chops. But for some people, and this I think actually honestly I was in this group. I really need some kind of a project, some kind of a collaboration that I'm working towards in order for my music to be meaningful. And so yeah, when I was first starting out, I didn't have obviously any credits, and so I would take on free work that amounted to absolutely nothing. But for me personally, it was not even about exposure, because I didn't expect that. It was more just like, you guys are obviously not making money for this. I am still in school. I just want to do something cool. And so, there's that sort of fine line because everyone is worried about, oh, well, if you can get music for free, then why should we ever pay? So it is a difficult thing to deal with, but I think that this is just sort of a very personal question that you have to just ask yourself: am I ready to just stop doing that and sort of mature as an artist and say, learn how to say no?
Yeah, on OCReMix, we have a problem sort of similar in a way of working on album projects. It's very easy to, there's so many album projects. People, even though there's money, people say yes to everything.
Yeah.
Invent their time.
Yeah.
So knowing when to turn something down, even when it's just for fun, actually, is important if you're limited time.
We're all gonna die someday. Well, I want to touch on something that I think Andy said. Dungeon Man was pretty successful and he did it for free. But another thing is you're also selling the Dungeon Man soundtrack.
Right.
And I know, Will, you have the Lara Croft soundtrack, but you put that up on SoundCloud for free. So, I mean, how does that work? I mean, you wrote music for these games, but then there's also, I mean, people are here at MAGfest because they love video game music, so people like to just listen to music outside of the games. So, when do you sell your soundtrack? When do you not sell it? Maybe we can talk a little bit about rights, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Ownership of music. What do you do as a composer? Do you keep rights, or does the company that you're working for have the rights? Or how does that work?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And my answer is probably going to be 100%.
Right.
Since I work mostly with AAA type stuff, you basically are always asked to just give up all rights to the music. It's not quite work for hire, but it is like a full buyout. So Crystal Dynamics basically owns every single thing that goes for the game. And so the decision to put the music up on SoundCloud, we have the soundtrack up, that came from Crystal Dynamics. I had to convince them to do it, but they wanted to do something for fans. They honestly had no idea that this more was like 120 minutes long or something. They thought it was just this little 15-minute thing, and I was like, no. And so, yeah, I was the one who convinced them to do this whole release schedule and put the music up there, just let the fans have it for free, charge them money. But it was an option between that and nothing. And so, I want my music to get out there because I'm very proud of it.
And it's good for them too, because it promotes the game.
It's a good, marketing tool. I actually didn't even talk to the audio guys about it. I talked to the marketing team because I was like, hey, guess what? You get to have more, marketing clips on the radar, by having this soundtrack. When I was working with LucasArts on the Star Wars scores, we were forbidden to put any soundtracks ever because John Williams was like, "This off. That's irrelevant bullshit." But yeah.
What's that? Wow.
We can talk later. He's a wonderful gentleman. But yeah, Yeah, so we weren't allowed to put soundtracks up. And so when someone would like bring music from the game and put it on YouTube, we would just celebrate. We were like, yeah, awesome. This is great. This is as good as it gets for us. And so coming out into the freelance world, that's one of the biggest kind of advantages to it, is that finally we're not in this sort of like musician cage. We can share our music out there. But that's that perspective. I mean, for indie games, I would think that you have a lot more control over how it gets disseminated.
Definitely. If Danny Bernowski and C418, Minecraft composer, etc., if they were here, they would speak to the fact that I think they've gotten the majority of their income from the soundtrack sales. I think we've said that publicly before. So that's sort of the angle that they take, which is perfectly, that's valid. If you want to take the approach of, rather than getting paid a lot of money up front, negotiate something where instead of the developer owning the soundtrack and owning all the rights to the music, you just say, well, I'm giving you a license to use the music, but I'm still going to own the rights. So if you own the rights, typically you can do whatever you want. Copyright is a weird thing where it's actually broken up into a lot of separate rights that can be transferred and shared. It's weird, but at the end of the day, I'd say the majority of indie developers are very much willing to say, oh, sure, you can keep the right to distribute the soundtrack. I don't care about that because I'm not going to use it as a developer, so I just need the right to put it in my game. And I think it's always 100% of the time a good idea to have your soundtrack, even if it's not for sale, even if you feel like, oh, it's just 2 tracks, I'm not going to sell it. I think it's basically always a good idea to at least put it on YouTube and SoundCloud. If you've done a soundtrack and you want to sell it, you could also talk to us at OCReMix and OC Records, because OCReMix hosts, of course, free stuff, and then if you want to sell it, you can put it on OC Records. So that's always cool. And maybe you can coordinate a remix project if you think it's for a big enough game.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't actually matter how big or small the soundtrack is. I know Jimmy Hinson, Big Giant Circles, he's done a whole bunch of soundtracks for Mass Effect, big games. He wrote the soundtrack for a game on mobile called Threes. I don't know if you guys have ever played this game, Threes. It's amazing.
It's a #1.
Yeah, it was like the game of the year. Yeah, it was like game of the year and a bunch of like mobile lists and stuff. There's one piece of music in that game, and he put that up like for sale. It's on Overclock Records. You can buy it, and it's like 3 tracks. He has like some unused like things that he didn't put in there. It's the Threes soundtrack, and it's 3 tracks, and it's tiny. And he has it up on like Overclock Records for like $1. I think it's like $1.
Why not?
Yeah, it's great music. And I don't know if he's made a lot of money off of it, but it's let's have Threes over there on this phone.
Yeah.
It's a great game.
Does anybody have,
I guess kind of really talk about what do you as a professional composer about sort of the rising trend of including soundtracks with games? How does that work for the composer?
Well,
Thinking about one Steam games,
yeah.
including soundtracks costs. How does that work?
For the people that I know that have done that, and I've done it myself as well, we put something in the contract for that. So we say, typically it would be something like, since Steam breaks it down on the developer side, they show you what is sold. You can say, okay, if the normal game sells, maybe I've negotiated a 5-cent royalty, and then if the bundle with the soundtrack sells, then that's $1 to me, or something like that. So you would actually write that as a separate thing in the contract. And when it comes to contracts, one thing I'll say about that is, yes, for a big project, you probably want a lawyer, but as long as it's clear and defined, a lot better than nothing. So if you just say, every copy of this soundtrack in game bundle sold on Steam, developer is to pay $1 within 30 days, or something like that, anything to get the final price. But yeah, that's usually a separate thing. I think it's fine, because a lot more people typically buy stuff on Steam, they'll just like buy it for nothing, especially if it's on sale.
Which says, so a little bit more about contracts. Where do you get this stuff? Like, how do you know what to put in a contract? Can you get contracts like pre-made, or do you need to talk to a lawyer for everything? Or
What do you not need to talk to?
I've only conferred with the lawyer on one project I've ever done. This is Dead Island. This is and the only reason that I did that was because it's a German developer, there's a whole international law, but everything else I just handled on my own. I've had a contracts template that I've just been evolving for the last like 10, 15 years or so, and I mean, honestly, it's the English language, it's just, you know, it's common sense. I mean, there's some legal terms that you should know about, and like sort of like, you know, boilerplate statements that you just have to put in there. Like jurisdiction, like if something comes up, what state should it, you know, be resolved and things like that. But otherwise, yeah, I think that, I'm pretty sure that the Game Audio Network Guild has some sample contracts.
They do, yeah. It's a great place to start.
And yeah, you know, basically the contract's only role is to just resolve differences and make them updated. And then also put into writing whatever compensation, you know, whatever rights, and even, and we didn't talk about this, I don't think, but you know, even if, and this is a little bit recycling back to something we were talking about before. Yes, there are games where you're not getting paid money, but there can be other services that you can get from doing this game.
Other services.
Yes.
Whoa. This is not an 18 plus panel. I need you to scale it back a little bit.
Thank you, water.
Well, yeah, but you know, a lot of times you'll be working with games that have very talented graphic artists at, you know, at Benall, for example, and so maybe you need a new website. Well, you know, maybe they can't pay for your music, but I can, you know, have them design my website. I can have them design my demos. I don't think I've ever paid for any of my presents, you know, in like any part of my online presence. It was all just, you know, one gig or another.
Harder reason.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you said you were paying Joe sample libraries, so like,
Yeah, oh, yeah.
So you talked about being well-rounded. I was just curious how important you think it is as a composer primarily to diversify into sound design and specifically
That's a good question. I'll say, in terms of, I know we'll have a lot to say, so I'll be brief. When it comes to diversifying, and actually it's pretty important to have a basic understanding of sort of programming, or at least programming logic. And I don't mean the logic, I mean the logic of programming. Not in the sense of you actually need to know syntax, like C++, but just to have an idea of how structures in games work, and how, so that if you're talking to a programmer and you're saying, you're trying to communicate an idea for how you want audio to be triggered, even if you are not in the code yourself, just knowing enough to get the gist, and so that you can be effective in a team environment. So I'm actually a little bit programming.
Yeah, I mean, I'm debating whether I should give like the diplomatic option a little bit controversial.
give me the controversy. Let's hear it. Let's get real.
All right. I'm just going to say this. You know, it's good to have knowledge of everything, but it's very rare to have someone who's equally good at composing and sound design. Usually, what happens is you either gravitate towards one or the other, or you know, it's like jack of all trades, master of none kind of situation. And so, I would almost say to make, you know what, like every game project needs at least one sound designer, and sometimes they need more. There's more kind of openings, I guess, for sound design than there are for composition. That's sort of just like a glib factor of reality or whatever. And it's such like, if you start to say like, oh, I can do music and sound design, what will happen is that you'll get more work, definitely, but I can almost guarantee that you'll mostly be doing sound design. Because, for example, what I talked about with Kickstarter, it's like, for whatever reason, 90% of those games, like, they already thought about music, but they didn't think about sound design. So you can go up to a game that looks great and say, oh yeah, this is really cool. And then you can say, can I do sound for your game? And they'll probably say yes. Whereas with music, it's almost all the time they're going to say, like, no, we already have music, we already have it. Almost every single time. And so if you're dead set on just writing music, then you kind of have to just write music. It's good to, you know, be able to do sound design if it's like in a pinch or whatever, but like most of the time I would just befriend a sound designer, many sound designers actually, and say like, hey, I want to work with you on this, I want to hire you on this, because you're obviously more, you know, that's your passion, and then I have my passion is music. So yeah, you know, this is controversial because most people give the exact opposite advice, but I think that if music is your thing and not necessarily sound, and you're passionate about it and you kind of believe in yourself, then just do music. so much money, no matter what you're doing. So it's like, do you really want to buy all that sound design when you do it? And all those sample libraries, you know, it's, anyway, that's my answer, is that, you know, pick one and kind of stick with it.
There's also voice. I mean, if you voice people in here, I guess voice is a little bit, it's almost like its own thing.
It is.
In some ways.
I mean, your wife Jill is a vocalist. She does
Right.
a lot of video game work.
Sure. I think like if you play an instrument, and if you do like VO stuff, those can almost be added on to some extent. Well, especially if you're an instrumentalist, you play instruments.
Oh, yeah.
And I know a lot of our friend Jeff Wall. He's a violinist, so he kind of gets hired for a whole bunch of different things. So that's fine. But and I think I've come to agree with Will on the sound design versus composing. And probably just want to specialize in one of those two.
Yeah, how often someone who's already in the industry, if they're going to make some sound library, you'll probably, and then maybe also do a mix on it themselves. How often is that maybe one of those contacts or sample library was sent to an external engineer? How much people are mixing their own stuff as well as some of those first time you're composing?
Right.
And then sending it to an audio here.
Sure. So in other words, like how often do we as composers have to do sort of the production, mixing, engineering side of things? Is that accurate? I'd say for like any indie project, 100% going to be doing your own stuff, unless you're like friends with somebody that's going to mix for you. But it's kind of weird. I don't usually hear about that. For the bigger projects, it tends to be the case that if it's mock-up stuff, so if you're working mainly with sample libraries, or if you're delivering, you know, electronic tracks, or rock or hip hop, something like that, it tends to be more the expectation that you'll probably be doing the engineering for that as well. Whereas if it's an orchestral thing, there will almost always be somebody that's handling the engineering. I think we'll speak more to that.
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, I only know one and a half composers who will do a live orchestral score and then also mix that score.
One and a half.
Because the other one isn't very good at it.
Oh, okay. Well, I told him to get real, so this is very real.
But no, it's usually they'll include that in the budget. They'll be very realistic about, you know, okay, well, we obviously need, you know, someone to handle this. Usually it's a recording engineer yourself who will also do the mix. As far as, you know, there is a very famous mixing engineer in LA called John Robbins. A lot of people will hire him to mix their mock-up orchestras. Like if they know, well, you know, we're not going to have a live orchestra in this game, it's just all going to be samples, then they'll deliver stems, which is like, you know, soloed out next in different sections of the orchestra. They'll deliver that to John, and he'll work his magic. I mean, he's been in the industry since forever, so he knows how to make anything sound amazing. He'll do that and then send it back and to suddenly it's much better sound. Again, like I said, with sound design versus code, like if this is your passion, you're very good at it, and you're going to spend a lot of money on the gear that you need to make it as good as it possibly can get. I can't possibly afford the amount of equipment that John has because, you know, he's amazing and this is his life. So if I send my stuff to him, he's going to make it sound incredible in ways that I couldn't possibly do.
Is there another question?
It kind of was similar to his, but as far as the mixing mastering engineering, you were talking about the collaboration earlier. What would you suggest would be like a great way to do it? Like if you, like I can compose and do audio engineering, would it be good to like collaborate if someone makes a track and I make some mastering, and then we both kind of just swap, and I'll compose something, he audio engineers? Would that be a good way to do things, or should it be another? Is there another way to do it?
You could definitely do that. And split it up so that one person's doing just writing and one person's doing mixing and mastering. I mean, certainly on OCReMix projects and various album projects that we've done, oftentimes that's come up a lot where somebody's done a track for a project and then I'm involved in it and they'll say, you know, would you mix and master this stuff? And you know, I usually prefer. I think it's ideal if the composer can kind of do their own stuff. But that's my personal opinion, because sometimes the choices you make when you're writing or selecting instruments, that affects the mixing. Like if you choose a really loud low brass patch, or bright low brass thing, or on the other hand, if you're writing like screaming guitar parts, something like that. If you were sort of mixing a little bit as you go, then it might help you make better choices. I've had stuff sent to me. One example, I won't say what project it was for, but I did a mix for this massive, it was like 70 or 80 tracks, so 70 or 80 different instruments. And I found it was next to impossible to deal with. And I think that the way it was given to me, they were just thinking, like, let's just do it and not worry about how it's the mixing. Let's put everything in and then we'll just send it and somebody will take care of it. And unfortunately, I think they weren't happy with how it came out in the long run. I wasn't happy with how it came out because there's just too much stuff. I mean, I did the best I could with what I was given, but sometimes when you're writing and mixing at the same time, you can make a decision like, you know what? I really have too many bass instruments here. I think I'm going to tone it down. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, and the other perspective on that, and that's a very clever way to work, is because sometimes you kind of get locked into how you perceive your own track, but that's not the reality of how it actually sounds. You just gotten used to it. So yeah, the traditional knowledge is like, oh yeah, you can mix your own stuff, but always get someone else to master it. That's what, that's what they'll teach you in like audio school or whatever. And there's some logic to that. You can get too used to not bringing bass that you thought was super cool at 2 a.m. But then someone else hears it and it's just like, dude, death, like what?
Yeah.
So it's good to have other ears. I think that if you are gonna mix and master your own stuff just because you have to, it's still good to like show it to someone else before it goes live.
Definitely, yeah, I agree.
Get their opinions on like how is this, how is that.
It also helps with consistency throughout your soundtrack. If you're writing a lot of tracks, you want everything to sort of happen.
Yeah, that's a whole other can of worms. Like, I don't know if we can talk about this here, but there are ways to do exactly that, to like make sure that your entire soundtrack has like even volumes and like tempo qualities. And it's kind of a technical thing because you have to like I'll use Reaper for that, and then I'll just put everything straight out. That just helps me to look at all the tracks at once and like have whatever EQ I need. But that's incredibly important to write on the projects.
Okay, we have a question over here.
With different composers emerging, how do you stay true to your style of composing, and how did you come to define your sound? Like, as an artist, I'm actually a vocalist, my husband is a composer, but I feel like I can use a lot of what you guys are saying as well. So it's like, a lot of times I'm nervous to listen to other people because I don't want to start writing like other people, but it's like I still want to, you know what I'm saying, like, so what everybody's doing, how do I stay true to my sound?
One thing I'll say about that is that somebody once said to me when I was a student, they said, there are two kinds of composers. There are people that can kind of do everything. They're like chameleons. They're asked to write in a certain style and just do that style perfectly. You ask them to do something, they can do it. And then there are people that they do one thing, they do it really well. My take on it personally is that it's when I'm thinking about who I want to hire for somebody, whether it's a violinist or a vocalist, usually my wife, but okay, male vocalist maybe, or just in general choosing who to work with, I tend to gravitate towards people that have refined the style and that they have a specific voice, they have a signature, because it sticks out in my mind more. So when I write as a composer, so that's me hiring people. As a composer, my style is I tend to do very rhythmic stuff, kind of driving. I don't do a lot of like really slow ambient music. I don't think I've never been hired to do it, and if I got hired to do something like that, I might talk to a friend for them to kind of handle more of that side of the soundtrack. I think that because I have a defined sound, people associate me with that sound, and it like builds up and up. So I mean, that's my take on it. I think it is valid if you want to try to be a more chameleon, but I think kind of being a specialist, that's what will help you stick out, and that's what will help you, hopefully get yourself out there. It helps you with marketability.
It is like, I mean, the weird thing is I don't really know which one I am, to be perfectly honest, because I've done a lot of things, and I think that I'm the worst judge of like what I personally write. It's like you write no perspective, but I will say that, I might say I'm writing like an orchestral score, but then I'm, working out or something and like listen to like, Tokyo Hotel or like Coldplay or something. And I just outed the fact that I listen to Tokyo Hotel, so that's cool. But anyway, I might hear something in, like rock music, but I think, that's cool. Why don't I use that? And it's like, it's all about sort of having some kind of like a translation from what you're hearing that you think is cool into your own music. I almost think of composition as, every composer has their big bag of tricks. Their big bag of techniques and like sonic ideas that they just think is cool. You're just making a mixtape, basically, is all you're doing. You're just kind of refracting back through your own personal experiences, but that's really all it is. When I was first starting out, I was worried about like, oh no, I sound too much like this, it's too much like that, and stuff. But eventually it was more like, once you write like a certain body of music or perform a certain body of tracks, you can then listen to your old music, like, your own music through the eras and just see like, well, what do I keep gravitating towards? What are the commonalities? And, you can, if you want, you can then focus on that and say like, all right, well, I notice I use harmony in this certain way. And even when I'm doing a different track that's completely different style, whatever, I still have these same kind of things that I come back towards. And, why not just explore them? And see like, okay, well, let's try it. Let's see what that's all about. And I think it's really cool that you also do vocals, because I think that with singing, you could also say like, I did this track a long time ago, and I did this weird thing when I had this like one word that I was pronouncing in a different way than I normally would. That sounded really cool. Like, we need to expand on it. We need to try something else with it, like a little vocal inflection that maybe you do, but not a lot of other people do. It's all about just sort of having that introspection.
Yeah. Hopefully that's
Great. Will, this might be more relevant for you. I wanted to talk a little bit about, indie versus in-house. You worked at LucasArts for quite a while, but then now you're kind of doing things independently. What are some of the advantages of both? What are some of the disadvantages or the cons?
I've been at this for a surprisingly long time, and when I started off, everyone starts off at an indie, right? Because it's like hard to, like, there aren't very many in-house positions out there.
So in-house, just to be clear, that's like when you're getting a salary, right?
Yeah, like you're working at one company, like exclusively, not allowed to do anything else, just in the office. I was basically freelancing for about 3 years before I started working with LucasArts. And I'm not gonna lie, it was pretty difficult, because back then, this was before like the XBLA, XMA kind of indie projects that could actually get finished. And so, you would go to conferences and things, and people would say like, oh, what games have you worked on? And it's like, nothing. Even though you've worked on like 20 titles, none of them ever came out, so it's like, well, what's the point of even answering that? It was very difficult, and very difficult to kind of get a foothold. Once I joined LucasArts, I wasn't even actually supposed to write music. I was hired as a music editor, and I kind of like cheated my way into writing music for the Old Republic. I just overheard that they were looking for an additional composer, and I wrote a little demo track and basically assaulted the music supervisor. Like, hey, I write too. Because I'm free, you're paying me anyways. But in-house, my worry when I was there was that, I'm just writing Star Wars music all the time. Maybe it won't be Star Wars, but maybe it will be like whatever franchise that one company does. I was very worried that my abilities would not be challenged enough, because it was just, I just didn't love pain. As soon as I went freelance afterwards, it was very different. It just felt like, oh, I can do anything I want. I can really look for quality. when you're clocking in and out, it's hard to deal with inspiration because you're just clocking in and out. Sometimes you just need to sit there from like 1 a.m. to like 5 a.m. or probably like 8 a.m. and just hammer at it because that's when you're inspired, that's when you know what the piece is supposed to look like, and it's starting to sound like music, so you don't want to just go home right once it's starting to be a musical piece. You want to keep working at it. So being freelance affords you that kind of a schedule to do that. Whereas in-house, you have to just work within the boundaries. I mean, the last game I worked on, Star Wars First Assault, it was like a 75-minute score. But it honestly took me like a year to write that, which is ridiculous. I did like twice that, like for 2 minutes, and that was like a couple months. So, it's not something that I recommend from like a creative standpoint, but at the same time, it is a guaranteed paycheck, right? You will meet with other people outside of music and audio, so that was a great way to learn so much about game development. I learned Python and Lua from LucasArts. I got free classes there. So I mean, it was a great learning opportunity. But I mean, I definitely prefer to be kind of work on all kinds of different things. Embrace the community, right? Right.
Yo. Music for games versus linear composition? Yeah. I'll mention this briefly. I haven't actually done really any like film work or anything like that. Yeah. No. I've done stuff for cinematics. I've done some stuff for TV. I guess one thing with games, so people talk about interactive music a lot with games. So that's music with multiple layers, or it's being triggered, and so it's not just one track of music. There's kind of some player-driven triggering going on in some way. But just like kind of more broadly, I think with games, there's a little bit more of a challenge in, I'd say on average, there's a little bit more of a challenge in sort of predicting what's going to be happening at any given point. There's a piece that I wrote for Dungeon Bands, which was it was like a boss battle thing, and the worst thing you can do with the battle theme is like you might write. Typically, you wouldn't write a piece of music that's intense the whole way through, like turned up to 11, just every second it's just turned up. Like usually, you have some dynamics, you have it going up and down and so forth. Now, Dungeon Bands is not an interactive soundtrack, but to be fair, actually, a lot of indie games are not. A lot of them have no interactivity at all. So, I wrote in one of the tracks, there's this like 5-second break. When I play the game, there's that, actually in the fight, and there's a very exciting part happening in the game, the music like dips down, like damn, I should have written that better. So that's always a challenge, which is helped by if the game has interactivity, because they can fade stuff in and out, and that's, makes it a little bit easier, but that's just something that's like pure practice and getting it, and playing the game ideally, and getting a sense of the pacing, because you can have something described to you, but the pacing and the tone of the game is really hard to truly understand unless you're playing even like an early build or maybe seeing a video, but just seeing like a concept document, I think that's rough. It's hard.
Yeah, linear is, I'm just going to come out and say it because I've already said offensive things. It's easy. It is much, it has a lot more politics around it that makes it artificially hard, but think about it this way. You're making an album, your CD or whatever, and you have a song. You're constantly struggling with like, okay, well, where do I go next? What should the next section be? How should this develop? And you have that same problem with video game music because you're also, you have your maybe 90-second or 2-minute loop or whatever, but within that you have to figure out, what's the form going to be? With the film, the form is already done for you. It's already, you already know. You've already discussed with your music editor and the director, like, here's where music starts, here's where it ends, and just fill it out with like whatever. So it is easy. I mean, because it's easier, you can have a lot closer relationship to the drama and the emotion, but it's still definitely a much more simple process. What I will say to kind of pick up on that is that if you do something in a film score, it's like one cue, and put it up against the screen and it doesn't work, then you just change it, and that's it. It takes like 2 seconds to make that call. In a game, You then have to render your entire track. You have to implement it into the game. You have to get to that point in the game through, like, hopefully you have the game with you, but if not, then like you're basically screwed. But then you have to play it, and that's when you decide, like, oh, yeah, this is good. It takes forever to make these kinds of decisions. It's very difficult to be your own supervisor in that regard. And then not to mention interactivity, where, you know, if you're doing an interactive score, then that's a whole other musical contortion you have to do. To give one example, for the Tomb Raider score, we have these overworld themes that are both ambient and action. It's what's called I guess a vertical interactivity, where they have like different layers where usually instruments just stack on top of each other, so it's like, what a game would typically do is, okay, here's the action track, it's like the full mix. But then we want ambient music, so we just take away the drums, take away brass, take away some synthesizer, whatever. What I found is that that kind of makes the ambient music a little bit compromised, because you don't have room for those kinds of like melodic kind of detail. And so instead, what we did was, we had the action tracks just be their own thing. They would have a separate percussion layer that we could use for crossfading, but that was it. And then the ambient music would be a completely different piece of music that just happens to be at the same exact tempo, the same time signatures, and the same harmonic rhythm, which it turns out is incredibly difficult to do, because it's like, if you want both to be independent and still kind of work in these constraints, you know, action music has a different kind of harmonic rhythm than ambient music. Harmonic rhythm, by the way, if you don't know, means like, how frequently are you changing chords and what chords are you changing to? So it was an incredibly difficult challenge that, you know, if I were just doing a film score, then it would be as easy as like, oh, just knock this out.
The guy got punched, put an orchestra in.
Yeah.
Orchestra hits on punches. All right, that's the secret. That's how to be a pro composer. Orchestra hits on punches. Okay. I think we got a question over here.
In Mass Effect, they used a tool called Wise, which is an audio engine. And what I think that you're talking about is they have a system where like there's different transitional segments that can lead from one piece of music to another, or even like from one intensity level to another intensity level. And what Wise does is it lets you have like what's called a preview grid that lets you just test out every possible, like, oh, I'm going from this to that, how does that sound? And that definitely helps out a ton, you know, with figuring out all the transitions. We're using the same software on Dead Island 2, and we also use this on First Assault. It's very powerful and a very good way to...
Pretty widely used, I'd say.
Yeah, it's actually probably one of those. Wise and F very popular.
The other question was just, one of my favorite composers is Jeremy Soule.
Naturally.
From what I've read, I like the history of Mass Effect.
I didn't do anything. Who did Mass Effect?
That was Jimmy.
That was Jimmy. He's not here, but he worked on Mass Effect 2.
We'll pass that on.
We'll tell him. We'll let him know.
We'll forgive him.
No problem.
In that case, the guy who developed the game really broke ground. You should read a script and try to convert the sound of that. It was a creative process.
That's a good question. For some projects, some projects are easier and lend themselves to that approach compared to other projects. So, a game with heavily interactive elements, like Mass Effect, or something where there's going to be this complex system, I think it's going to be pretty tricky to do that. You might be able to start by writing some pieces to maybe establish a general set of instruments. You might be able to, let's say, in some cases, the directors of the game, the developers, they might not even know exactly what they want. They might say, here are some inspirations, but they're very different. And so you might start writing just to say, okay, are we talking like, you know, Blade Runner, or are we talking, you know, Tron? You know, what do you exactly mean? So that, you might start there. The games where it's easier to do that tend to be just simpler games in general. You know, 2D games, games where there is no interactivity, ones where there are more established, I hesitate to say, like tropes. So if somebody says they're making a throwback JRPG, then I already have a sense of the kind of stuff that's going to be in that, and I can start writing because I'm familiar with it. Whereas if they have this, you know, concept for a game that I haven't seen before, it's less common, or they're using an unusual setting, it's going to be a lot harder, even with a script, to understand what they're going for before I actually play the game. So the thing is, with indie games at least, a lot of indie games tend to be like throwbacks. In one sense or another, they're combining, you know, X and Y, but it's still stuff that we all understand because they're harkening back to, you know, like NES, SNES. So it tends to be a lot easier to write for those games before you even play them.
That's a very good question. I would say that a lot of the larger games that I've worked on so far, they usually tend to bring in music about halfway through development, so there's a good healthy amount of time to kind of like explore, is what I would probably call it. So you can write some pieces that aren't necessarily meant to be in the game, but it's almost like musical concept art, and that would be based off of like if there is some gameplay that you can look at, or maybe a script. For the Old Republic, we actually didn't have a chance, for various reasons, we didn't have a chance to actually play the game or even look at the footage because it just didn't work at the time. So we only got concept art and not the script, because that would be, we got like story synopses for each planet, and that's how I sort of based my music for that one. So I would just say like, all right, well, this planet seems like it's sort of like political intrigue meets like ancient prisons meets, you know, like a little bit of like hidden magical weirdness. And so I would use those sort of adjectives to derive some kind of a musical texture. And I would just go off of that. In Star Wars First Assault, we had a much longer period. Like I was working on that game for about 2 years. And also I was sort of temporarily being an audio, which contradicts completely what I said about like becoming just a musician or a singer. But it was not by choice. But yeah, so I had the perspective of like, I was in those meetings with, you know, the animators and the programmers and like lead artists, and I knew what they were going for emotionally. And I could sort of write these, again, musical concept art pieces that weren't meant for anything other than just like steering me in the right direction. And so yeah, I guess the short answer is you just try to soak up whatever you can. Gameplay footage is great. That's, I think, one of the best ways that you can, one of the best sources to write from. But failing that, you know, concept art works too, you know, environment pieces and any kind of synopses, even like, you know, if you could just get on the phone with the developer, you can hear his sort of personal side, you know, things that can't really put down on the page. But you just hear his sort of voice when he's talking about one thing or another. You can see what he's, you know, you can see why he's making this game, you know, from that conversation.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think we've covered most of the talking points, actually, unless you have some more talking points we can cover.
I never heard someone choosing a game because, you know, my artist name is Zircon. I'm never going to be the top Google result for Zircon, so I would say, if you haven't like selected a name for yourself yet or your company, try to choose a unique name.
Yeah.
That isn't already appropriate to do.
SEO is important.
SEO is important. Just wanted to mention.
Okay. Choose a name that starts at the beginning of the alphabet also, so that you can like do this first.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, A versa. There you go. A versa. That's good. That's
Sure.
We'll go decide.
Are there any other questions? I got a couple.
We have a question back there.
Yeah, back to the composition side, but how often do you see mixers also be the designers? Someone who would, and you know, in logic, would also be hands-on and actually create the often, or do you
For projects I've worked on, even indie projects, I find that when you have a smaller team of people, it tends to be the case that you end up doing multiple things. So I've been given access, and I ask for access to like Exact or F1 or whatever, so that I don't have to bother like the one programmer to implement my stuff. So I think it comes up pretty frequently there. How is it in Drupal?
So that's like, was the question like, do composers also implement their own work?
More producers, I guess, which is not mentioned earlier, but also the actual designer who will implement the game that's launched. Are they all the same person?
Yeah. So a little bit of like, just a step back real quick. Usually, if we're going to hire a mix engineer to work on the game, he's sort of this offline like part of the music team that doesn't really touch the game itself in any way. He's like like a guy in LA or like Montreal or wherever. He's just like operating on that level, and then he just sends it back to me, and I interface with the game. It's usually not like if you look at the credits for like a game score, it's like a larger thing. Usually they separate out the music credits because there's a lot of people who have very little to do with the game itself. It's just that they're working for the composer. So the mix engineer would be that guy. As far as who's putting the music in the game, like Andy said, it depends on the like echelon, like the budget. In a AAA game, it's usually someone on the audio team. Sometimes it'll be a sound designer. Sometimes if you're like Sony, then you have a team of like 20 guys, and that's the only thing they do is just like working their own tools usually, or WIs to implement music. But then what's kind of interesting is that, again, at that like very expensive level, they'll also have mix engineers in-house, and their job is to separate out the stem that they recorded so that they can say, okay, here's like Uncharted 3. You're going to have like this part of the game, you'll just use like the string stem of this track, maybe with even like the percussion of this other track or something like that. But they're making those kinds of decisions and making those kinds of edits and implementing that into WIs. Or their own Sony tools. But yeah, it's like it's usually not a level designer doing this at the top levels. But again, like once when you have a smaller budget, then people kind of take on different responsibilities.
Anything goes. Yes. Okay. There's another question.
We had another question right here. Yeah.
I already used it as a
never let the lack of like some degree, never feel like that holds you back. It doesn't. It's all about how you've trained yourself. I think it's very helpful to even if you want to like check out a well-known harmony from the library and like read it and see like, oh, okay, yeah, this is kind of cool, getting ideas. But one thing I've noticed, just sort of being real for a second, is that there's some folks I know. Real talk. There's some folks I know who, they're like, oh, yeah, I never studied harmony, but I'm like, are you sure? Because your stuff sounds really cool. And they made decisions that I never would have thought of, and that's what made the music interesting. So yeah, I mean, it's up to you. I would use theory as a way to explore other people's music and to understand what they did and why they did it. But it's not, music theory is not a generative process. It's more just observations of what other composers did and trying to explain them in various ways.
That's a good way of putting it.
Prescriptive rather than descriptive. Vice versa. Right? That's how you say it.
Okay.
How do you know which criticisms to dismiss or to take seriously when developing your own style?
Sorry, what was which ones to take seriously? I didn't hear the last part.
Which ones to dismiss?
Okay. Well, OCReMix judges panel. That's something you should take it to heart. Actually, I think. Well, okay. When you're talking about criticisms, just like in general, I'd trust. If I write a track or I make a mix or something like that, there are people that I will ask, and I trust their opinion and go to them first. If somebody gives me an unsolicited criticism and it lines up with something that somebody else said, I'll consider it more. But in general, the more your music gets out there, the higher the chance that you're just going to get like random criticism, and that's something that on OCR happens all the time. You know, people will say stuff that is wildly inaccurate, like YouTube commenters, and so you almost have to be like kind of dismissive by default, unless you see there's like a common theme that, you know, the drums here are too quiet. You know, a lot of people are saying that. Okay, maybe take it to heart, but really, I think the best way to deal with criticism and get helpful criticism is to find, you know, a small set of your colleagues, your friends that you look up to, that you trust, that you think are skilled, and then you sort of ask them first. And then that way, they're kind of getting random stuff from random people, and it doesn't really line up with what they said. Maybe you say, oh yeah, whatever, that guy didn't like the vocals, well,
yeah, that's a good question. It's very difficult. It's kind of very difficult to decide, you know, how much am I going to accept what other people say, and then how much am I going to stick to my guns. I think especially if you're using some kind of a pop or electronic style, because the possibility is literally infinite. You can do anything. So who's to say like, oh, well, this is bad. I write mostly acoustic-based music, and the music I write is balanced to the reality. So it's like you can either play this or you can't. And that's all there is to it. So that's why it's in a way easier to, you know, to sort of criticize an orchestral piece. It's just like if you have like, you know, something that's just literally impossible to play, then you can easily, you know, latch onto that. What I will say though, in addition to that, is again, I've been writing for kind of a surprisingly long time. And there's been eras in I guess my musical life where I think that I just listened too much to criticisms. And you know, it's like imagine you're making a sculpture, that's your musical therapy. You know, you can sand it down to be like this perfectly, you know, shiny machine, but then it's like it's lost all character. So you have to sort of be very introspective about, you know, is this a time for me to just be working on the technique and, you know, making sure that everyone is happy and all that, or is this a time for me to explore, you know, what makes me me? You know, what is it? What's so great about me? What's so special? Why am I writing in the first place? And I think that there's different times in your sort of musical life where one is more important than the other. There's times when it's like, yeah, I really got to focus on techniques, I'm learning this new style and whatever. But then there's times where you kind of have to step back and say, you know what, people are going to say whatever they're going to say, but there's something I'm trying to do, and it's a question that only I can answer.
Do you find that you run up against that a lot in the professional sphere? So if you're writing something for like a game, you know, someone else on the team, any audio, maybe developer or someone will just be like, what's going on there? I don't understand what you're doing. Can you change it? Do you find that you need to change it?
Says like, hey, I don't like this is bullshit, then yeah, you have to change it.
Sure.
I mean, you can sort of talk with them, and it just depends on what kind of relationship.
Sure. Challenge them to a fist, but
yeah,
it usually goes over.
Or square your hits.
Yeah. And so you should go with each function. But you know, one of the most difficult experiences I've ever had, I won't say which game it was, but people got it. I had a committee instead of a single person that I would work with. He's lovely because he talked to bullet on this game. But yeah, I had a committee that I had to get past for every single piece of music I was writing. And so one person in this sort of team of like, you know, 8 people, they would say like, oh, this sounds too much like sci-fi. We're making like a, you know, horror game. And I'd be like, how the hell does this sound like sci-fi? And it was only through like, you know, goading and prodding or whatever that I realized that like, oh, I used like one electric guitar power chord and it made me think of Halo, and then suddenly it's sci-fi. You know? It's shit like that. You know, you have to just kind of deal with it to, you know, talk to people about it. You know, people are stupid. You know, they're always going to come to an agreement. And if they're not, then maybe it's not an agreement that you should be working.
Or yeah, not a fight that you want to take on.
Yeah, pick your battles. Sure.
Exactly.
Well, we have about 10 minutes left. We can take more questions if you guys have questions.
Joe.
So, like, in terms of hours a day, I understand it changes depending on what project how much time do you devote to, if you're both freelancers, managing your business, hunting new work, and actually performing your art?
That's a great question. I'll answer probably for me, like 2 to 4 hours a day minimum is what I'm spending on like business-related stuff, and I'm including emails within that. So a lot of it I'm now organizing through Trello, which I highly recommend. It's Trello, just because I'm having a hard time now keeping things straight. So Trello just allows you to more easily track and categorize just anything. Like it's very open-ended. So I'll have something like, here are the things I want to do for the week. And it might be like, I need to render this stuff, and I need to write and track here, and I want to get like this thing 50% done. I mean, it does, that adds a bit of overhead to even look at that, but it pays off in the long run. I find it makes me more productive because when you are a freelancer, nobody's telling you what to do, usually. You might have some deadlines, but it's up to you to figure out like which ones do I prioritize. It's rare that you're working literally one thing and nothing else. So yeah, I'd say about 2 to 4 hours for a day.
Yeah, he's a lot more organized than I am, so I'm not going to try to answer that question, but I will say that it fluctuates based on where you are in projects. I mean, I'm at a point right now where it's like almost at the capacity of like how much work I can possibly do all the time that I'm at quality. So it's like I'm not really too much looking for new work, but you know, I still try to keep up with maintaining contacts and making sure that things are the way they are for the next year. But again, like, you know, once I finish like one soundtrack, then I immediately say like, okay, how can I fill out this time with the next one? Which might be 2 soundtracks down the line, but it's like I still need to make sure that I'm going to be employed like next year. And especially with the AAA stuff, things move pretty slowly, so you have to get in like very, very early in the process. So it can be a very long kind of gestation period with the development before you get like officially started.
Another question over here. That's a good question. Well, you want to take this out?
Yeah, well,
So you cry a lot. You find out who your real friends are. They're the ones who can deal with the asshole. No, if you did music that belongs to the developer, then even if the developer no longer exists, it still belongs to them. You know, whoever picked up them from the putrid ashes of the stage. Then like, yeah, so there's really nothing you can do there. But if you were working on an indie title that's you still retain the rights to the music, then yeah, you can absolutely repurpose it if you want. Maybe you can talk a little bit about music libraries, because that's another.
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, if you kept the rights to your music, there's stuff I wrote I wrote this really shitty Xbox indie game like years ago called Fist. The developer like vanished off the map and it never got paid. But the music has been used all over the place. I put it in the music library, which is like a stock music thing. People can license your stuff and you get paid for that. It gets used all the time on Twitch and YouTube. I sell the album on iTunes and Amazon and Bandcamp and Overclock Records. And it's awesome. So when you keep the rights, it's like, the sky's the limit. Just like, use that music as much as you possibly can. So we can talk more about that.
There's a lot of stuff you can do aside from just having your music used in the game.
Right, but if it was for a work for hire or a AAA thing, then like, yeah, you do just right, I guess.
Any more questions?
Yeah, look back.
That's way in the back, yeah.
How has this changed your personal life? For example, do you just enjoy something now music-wise, and you automatically use work mode when you're playing a game or something like that's not right, like that, and then like you're doing it like that?
Does it like interfere with our ability to like enjoy music and playing games or something like that?
If I weren't writing music for a game, I wouldn't have nearly as much fun playing games. It's like I can hear, not only am I enjoying the music like as music, but I can hear the decisions that they made and see how they relax. It's like a film, especially. Film music is meant to be in the background and not even heard. But if you study film music, then now you understand. It's like a game. You like understand what they're doing. You can see what's going on. There's like, I mean, they're still surprises even though you detect it. It's like,
Yeah. there is one downside, which is that I have a really hard time not hearing presets, like drum loops and stuff. That's OCReMix. I have that.
We should probably wrap this up. Just a couple things. Will mentioned before Game Audio Denizens, which is a Facebook group. That's a good opportunity for networking. There's also the Game Audio Network Guild, which is a website, gang.
Yeah, and tonight, once again, at 7 p.m. at the
The Cadillac Ranch at 7 p.m. There's a gang event.
It's gang go.
And also, this panel is presented by OCReMix. So check out the site, OCReMix.org. It's a community for video game remixing, appreciation of video game music as an art form. It's actually a pretty good way to build your skills as a composer, right? As an artist, yeah. So
that's where
Andy got started. So OCReMix.org. So check us out.
We're
going to hang out a little bit outside, or here after this panel. So if you guys want to chat with these two guys, feel free. All right. So
thank you for coming.
Sound Library